My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. This is a picture of Lucrezia de Medici, who was believed to have been the last Duchess, and the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso II, is the one who is believed to have poisoned her when she was just 16 years old. Browning's dramatic monologue from Alfonso's perspective explores his attitude towards his previous wife to an unnamed emissary, someone who's there to negotiate his second marriage. He is telling the man about his last Duchess, which links to the title, but the word my in the title is also quite problematic because it tells us that he sees her as an object and as a possession. As the poem progresses, his patriarchal authority and horrific crime are uncovered using impressive descriptions of hypothetical situations and mimicry, voice mimicry. It is a performance meant to win the person over and also to serve as a warning about the kind of wife he will not tolerate. And this is what it is believed he looked like. This is a painting of the Duke Alfonso of Ferrara, a place in Italy. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands work busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me if they durst, how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus? Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only caught that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one, her favour at her breast, the drooping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries from some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush, at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of 900 years old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive. Will it please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed, is starting as my object, nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Inbruck cast in bronze for me. So just briefly, it is quite a long monologue. It's a fairly long poem, but in essence, it's a discussion that he's having with an emissary from the family of his next wife. And he's talking about his last Duchess. There's a painting of her on the wall. And he says to him, oh, so you want to know about this passion, this depth of passion in her earnest glance. And you're not the first to ask me this. I'm the only one who draws this curtain, as I've drawn it aside for you to look at this painting. And they would ask me about that look, this colour in her cheek, that spot of joy, he calls it. And then he talks about his jealousy. He would say, any small compliment paid or any small favour given her, a little of some cherries or a ride around the terrace on her white donkey, anything like that, any compliment, any flattery, any small gift, and she would blush, she would have this spot of colour in her cheek. And he just couldn't cope. He was too jealous. He felt that the gift of his 900 years old name, the name Ferrara, the Duke of Ferrara, she ought to be more grateful, really. And he says, who'd stoop to blame the sort of trifling, even had you skill in speech, which I have not, which is ironic, of course, because he does have skill, to make your will quite clear to such an one. There would be some stooping, he says, and I am not going to stoop. I never stoop. He's too proud. He's arrogant. And so he decided to give commands. Then all smiles stopped together. And so that's how he tells the story of how he killed his young wife, who enjoyed compliments and enjoyed the small things in life so much that he couldn't handle it. His jealousy got out of hand, and he gave orders, he gave commands, and it is believed that he poisoned her. And then he says, will it please you rise? Would you like to get up now, and we'll go downstairs and we'll talk about the next marriage, my next marriage. So this poem, this discussion with this emissary serves as a warning. This is the kind of behavior I will not accept from my wife. And then he says, come, let's go downstairs. And he talks about a statue of Neptune on the way down. And so it really is appalling, actually. It's a poem, as you know, by Robert Browning. And Robert Browning would have been very interested in the Renaissance because of the juxtaposition of the human, the religious, the moral, and the aesthetic in art. For me, the aesthetic is the way that this has been written. Obviously, art itself and beautiful objects and possessions. These are certainly things themes in this novel, if you like. His wife, his late wife, my last Duchess, and she is an artwork. She is an artwork on the wall as a painting, but she was something that he owned as a person. And when he couldn't fully own her and couldn't fully take control of how she expressed herself, he had her killed. And so that ties into the human and the moral, and certainly the religious. And these were things that they were fascinated by. What's quite clever about the structure is that it's in rhyming couplets in iambic pentameter. And you'll remember iambic pentameter is 10 syllables per line in pairs. So let's say we have 2 syllables. The first 2 syllables starts with an unstressed syllable and then a stressed one. So a softer syllable and then a louder syllable. Soft, loud. So we've got pairs of syllables. 2 times 5 is 10, and that is pentameter. It's 10, a beat of 10 per line. And why I say this is particularly clever is that the couplets rhyme even though there is enjambment. So the sentences don't end perfectly at the end of the line. They run into each other. The lines run into each other. The syntax and semantic meaning of each sentence run over, and so we have enjambment, and that makes the revelations themselves run into each other in quite a compulsive way, the way that the Duke feels compelled to spill everything quite cleverly, because one has to read between the lines to actually find out what really happened. So the Duke is portrayed as quite a compelling speaker. He mimics voices, and he makes this horrific revelation almost seem quite acceptable. Why should he not get rid of this young wife who he can't bend to his will? And Browning foregrounds his narcissism, his arrogance, his pride, and so on by presenting his point of view in this way. The reader is both fascinated and repelled. We have to determine the truth not by what is said, but by what is unsaid. And some of the glossary. Fra Pandolf is the painter. Durst means dared. Who durst? He means who dared. No one would have dared to ask him. He speaks of a favor that in this sense could mean a small token of regard, like a flower. And when he speaks of his 900 years old name, he's talking about as the Duke of Ferrara. His name is aristocratic and goes back into antiquity. So his name was D'Este, but his title is the Duke of Ferrara. Warrant means guarantee. So if he says, I warrant this and that, he means I guarantee that. And pretense, he's not talking about pretense in the modern sense, when we pretend or subterfuge or anything like that. He's talking about his pretense, his suit, his hope for the hand in marriage. Okay, so I'm going to go through it more carefully now. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands work busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you? Sit and look at her. So there's my last Duchess painted on the wall, and she looks as though she were alive. And it's a wonder, this painting. It's beautiful. He worked busily on it. And will it please you to sit and look at her? Would you like to have a seat and look at the painting? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you, that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I've drawn for you but I, and seemed they would ask me if they dared, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So he says that people, he imagines, do also recognize what you've asked me about the look in her face, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, this depth and passion he sees there. And had they dared, they would have asked me about it, how such a glance came there, how such an expression came upon her face. So you're not the first to turn and ask thus. So perhaps the visitor did ask about the expression on her face, or perhaps he imagines that the visitor would have liked to have asked that and he's filling it in. There seems to be a compulsiveness about the way he speaks. So I almost think that perhaps the person didn't ask at all and he's just volunteering this as if to say, I imagine you must have wanted to ask that, or perhaps he thought he did ask it, but it's perhaps just his compulsive need to confess what happened. But of course he has an ulterior motive. He wants to tell this emissary what happened as a warning to his future wife that this is the kind of thing he won't tolerate. Right, so the opening lines discuss the painting, and there is a song by Christa Berg that I'm not going to play. It's called The Painter, and it has a similar theme, and the only difference is instead of a duchess, it's a queen, and instead of lots of compliments being paid and perceived slights being paid by other people, it's in the painter in particular that the speaker is jealous about. So you can find that online. I'm not going to go to the song. I'm just going to bounce ahead. And seemed as they would ask me if they durst, how such a glance came there. Right, we've said that part. So it was not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. It wasn't only me that made her blush like that, call that spot of joy into her cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, so perhaps one of the things the painter said would have made her blush. Her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. Beautiful colour, the half blush on her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, it was politeness, she thought, but it was cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad. This is his jealousy at play here. She was too easily flattered, he believed. This is how he perceived it, the blush in her cheek. Too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Very jealous. So 'twas all one. My favour at her breast, the drooping of the daylight in the west. She was flattered by everything, he says. So these are the sentences that tell you the Duke was jealous. What was it about the Duchess that annoyed him and made him feel jealous? And it was the things that I've mentioned brought the spot of colour into her cheek. So she would be too easily impressed by compliments, the half flush that the painter noticed along her throat, and whatever she looked upon that she enjoyed. So you can imagine this young 16-year-old being easily impressed by things, by the beauty in life, by small compliments, and blushing because of them. And of course he cannot tolerate that because he is far too jealous and far too prideful and far too arrogant. Too easily impressed, she liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So it was all one. My favour at her breast, the drooping of the daylight in the west. The bough of cherry some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace. All and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of 900 years old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. So in this part of the poem, he's talking about he's listing the things that would impress her. My favour at her breast, the drooping of the daylight in the west, so the sunset, the bough of cherries that some officious fool, someone broke off in the orchard for her some cherries, or her riding her white mule around the terrace. Each of these would get from her the same joy and a approving speech, he says, or a blush or something. She would thank them. But she would thank him the person in a way that the Duke did not like. He says there he can't really express it at first, or at least that's the way it seems, but perhaps this is calculated. He'd say, somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. I have bestowed upon her my name, my wonderful aristocratic name that stretches back into antiquity, and she's as grateful for that as she is for a bough of cherries, he seems to suggest. And he says, who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? So why should I stoop then about this? Stoop down and tell her off. Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, which is a lie, because of course, ironically, he does have a lot of skill, as we can hear in the poem, to make your will quite clear to such an one and say, just this and you disgusts me. So were I to say this or that, you miss the mark or exceed the mark. You're not good enough in this way, you miss the mark, or you're over the top in this way, you go over the mark. This about you disgusts me, even if I were to say those things, he says. So the examples of the things that he feels are, he perceives as a slight, are things like the joy she sees at the sunset, the joy at a bough of cherries that someone's picked for her, riding her white mule. All of these things he feels she was just too pleased about, blushed and enjoyed and thanked too much. And so, of course, is this enough to poison her? Of course not. And it tells us that he is a prideful man, a narcissist, very full of himself. And the way that he recounts his version of events is quite bitter. It's chillingly controlled, not at all remorseful. And then he goes on to say, in speech which I have not to make your will quite clear, just this or that, and you disgust me. So he's thinking about how he would have told her off, here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be less than so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. So even if she allowed herself to be told what he needs to tell her, or plainly set her wits to yours and made herself right in truth and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. So he's saying he could never sort of back down in any way. There'll be no stooping at all in allowing this, or in allowing in having to step down at all and accept what she says to him. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile. So she may have smiled at me, for sure, but she'd smile at everyone, get the same smile. This grew, okay, this grew. So what's ironic is what actually grew was his jealousy, not what she was doing. She was just a delightful young 16-year-old bride. I gave commands, and this is where we can infer that the poison comes in. Then all smiles stopped together, and that'll be because she's dead. And then he says quite callously, quite glibly, there she stands as if alive. But she's not alive. He's killed her. Will it please you rise? Would you like to get up now? We'll meet the company below then. And so that's the end of that. The lines that tell you that he eventually tired of feeling like everyone received the same treatment and smiles. How did he try and bend her to his will? And which lines tell you that she is dead? Well, we know which lines say that she was dead, because all smiles ended. And the lines that tell us he was tired of feeling like everyone got the same smiles. He said, with anybody's gift, he says at the top of the slide. And he says, oh, sir, she smiled no doubt whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile, he says. It's just chilling, because from there, from saying he's killed her, or implying it anyway, he says, will it please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the count your master's known magnificence, his wealth, is ample warrant, is ample guarantee that no just pretence suit of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed as starting, is my object. Unbelievable. He then moves on to talk about the question of dowry, how his main interest is obviously the daughter. That is his starting. It's my object. So when he talks about it is my object, he's talking about that is what he wants. Not necessarily it's what he's hoping for. It's my object, but ironically uses a word object, which might even be seen as a little bit of wordplay in this context, a little tongue-in-cheek by Browning, because his past wife became an object, a painting upon a wall. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. let's go down together. No, we'll go down together, sir. And on the way down, he says, down the stairs, notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. It's absolutely dreadful. How he then goes on in the final stanza, the most chilling of all, as he returns to the business of arranging his marriage to his next wife and casually points out another work of art in his collection, just like my last Duchess.